The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, and the first thing Colin Carter noticed was how quiet it was. Not the quiet of an empty office. The quiet of people who had been told to keep their voices down. He stepped out onto the marble floor and adjusted the strap of his bag. The receptionist at the front desk looked up, then looked back down at her screen before he reached her. She had the particular stillness of someone who had been briefed. "Colin Carter," he said. "I have a 9 o'clock with Hargrove Capital." She typed something without looking at him. "They're running a few minutes behind. You can take a seat." He didn't take a seat. He stood near the window that faced west over downtown Toronto and watched the traffic on Bay Street 19 floors below. A streetcar was stopped at King. Somebody on the sidewalk was eating a sandwich and reading something on their phone at the same time, and doing neither particularly well. Colin had been awake since 5, not because he was anxious. He'd given up on anxiety somewhere in his early 40s, after the second restructuring and the year his marriage quietly came apart like a seam that had never been properly stitched. What he felt now, standing in the reception area of the most significant private equity firm in the country, was something more like a tension, a sharpening, the same thing he felt before a deposition or before the moment in a negotiation when the other party realized they'd miscalculated. He was 51 years old. He had spent 23 of those years in structured finance, the last 9 as an independent advisor working on transactions that the major firms considered too complicated, too slow, or too politically sensitive to touch. He was good at his work in the way that certain people are good at things they've never been able to fully explain. Through a combination of patience and the willingness to sit with information longer than most people could tolerate. He had a daughter named Ava who was 9 and lived with her mother in Oakville. He saw her every other weekend and every Wednesday evening, which was not enough, and he had spent 3 years finding a way to be at peace with that, without actually being at peace with it. He had submitted his materials to Hargrove Capital 6 weeks ago, when their senior director of acquisitions left abruptly, and a mutual contact, a woman named Frances Holbrook who owed him very little but had integrity enough to pay the debt anyway, passed his name along. He had not expected a callback. He had received one in 11 days. The receptionist said, "Mr. Carter, they'll see you now." The boardroom was at the end of a corridor that had no art on the walls, just glass offices on one side, and a row of closed doors on the other. Colin followed her past 2 associates who didn't look up, and a third who looked up and then immediately found something else to look at. There were 4 people in the room. He recognized Elliot Baird immediately, the managing partner, 63, hair gone white, the kind of face that had been photographed enough times that it settled into a permanent approximation of authority. He'd seen him at an industry dinner 3 years ago, but they had never spoken. Beside him sat a woman Colin didn't know, mid-40s, dark blazer, notepad already open with handwriting on it. Across the table, 2 men, both younger, both the type of young that firms like this manufactured in batches, careful, competent, not yet certain whether they were being observed or doing the observing. "Mr. Carter," Baird didn't stand. "Thank you for coming in." Colin sat down. He put his bag on the floor and folded his hands on the table. "We've reviewed your file," Baird said. "Frances speaks highly of you. Frances is generous." The woman with the notepad introduced herself as Dr. Renata Kovac. She was the firm's head of risk assessment, she said, and she would be asking most of the technical questions. Colin noted the slight pause before she said, "most." They began. The first 20 minutes were standard. His methodology on the Meridian Bridge file, his role in the Lakeshore infrastructure restructuring, his position on the Queenston deal, which had been contentious in ways the public record didn't fully capture. He answered each one the same way he answered everything, with the minimum number of words necessary to be accurate. Then Kovac set her pen down. "We're considering you for the director role," she said. "But there are some concerns about your profile that I want to raise directly." "Please," Colin said. "You've worked independently for 9 years. That's a long time to be outside of an institutional structure. The concern is whether someone with your work pattern can operate within the governance requirements of a firm like ours. Reporting lines, committee approvals, sign-off protocols." She paused. "You've been your own authority for almost a decade." It was a fair point. He knew it was a fair point because he had thought about it himself on the drive-in that morning, sitting in traffic on the Gardner with the radio off. "That's accurate," he said. Baird looked at him. "I've operated independently because the work required it," Colin continued. "Not because I prefer to avoid oversight. There's a difference between those 2 things, and I think you know that, or you wouldn't have called me in." He let that settle for a moment. If the concern is whether I can function within your governance structure, the honest answer is I don't know. I haven't done it in 9 years. What I can tell you is that I've never made a decision in that time that I wouldn't have made in front of a committee. Kovac wrote something. One of the younger men, his name was apparently Theo Marsh, he'd introduced himself at the start, leaned forward slightly. Can you speak to the Vanderbilt Road project? There were some questions about your billing structure on that file. Colin looked at him. There were questions raised by one party who was unhappy with the outcome. The questions were reviewed and found to have no basis. That's in the public record. The optics, though, I'm not responsible for optics, Colin said. I'm responsible for the work. There was a brief silence. Baird picked up a pen and turned it between 2 fingers. We're also looking at 2 other candidates, he said, both with continuous institutional experience. I understand. Given that, what would you say is your strongest case for this role? Colin considered the question. Not for long. He had considered it before, in the same way he considered every question that mattered, which was to find the true answer rather than the useful one. I've spent 9 years on files that didn't have clean outcomes, he said, not because I sought out complexity, but because the files that needed the most attention were the ones other firms couldn't or wouldn't commit to. If what you need is someone who will tell you what you want to hear and execute within a narrow margin, I'm not that. If what you need is someone who will sit with a bad situation until it becomes clear, I am. Baird looked at Kovac. Kovac looked at her notepad. The second younger man, whose name Colin had already released from memory, cleared his throat. We appreciate your candor. That was the phrase Colin had learned over many years to interpret correctly. It meant the conversation was ending. It meant they had decided something, and the rest of the meeting would be courtesy. He thanked them for their time. He shook Baird's hand and Kovac's hand in the hands of both young men. He picked up his bag and walked back down the corridor past the closed doors and the glass offices and the associates who had found other things to look at. The receptionist was on the phone. She raised one finger as he passed, then lowered it. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened immediately, as if they had been waiting. Outside, Bay Street was doing what Bay Street always did, moving indifferent various. He walked south toward his car and thought about Ava, which was what he always did when he needed to think about something real. She had a school project due Thursday, something about ecosystems. She'd called him Sunday evening to ask whether a river counted as an ecosystem or just a part of one, and he'd said both, which she'd found annoying because it wasn't a clear answer. He thought about the drive back to his apartment in Leslieville. He thought about whether he would feel differently about this in the morning, and decided he probably wouldn't. What he did not think about was whether he had handled the interview correctly. He had said what was true. He always said what was true, not because he had a particular philosophy about honesty, but because he had found, over the course of a long career, that the truth was the only thing that held its shape. Everything else had to be maintained. The truth just stayed. He reached the parking garage on Wellington and took the ticket from his wallet. The attendant, a young man with a Raptors cap pushed back on his head, said, "Your vehicle will be up in a few minutes." "Thanks," Colin said. His phone buzzed. A text from Ava's mother, Sheila, about the Wednesday pickup. Could he do 5:30 instead of 5 because her meeting was running long? He typed back yes and put the phone away. The attendant brought the car around. A 10-year-old Volvo in a dark gray that was practical without being entirely without character. He tipped the attendant and got in and sat for a moment with the engine running. He did not feel sorry for himself. He had learned, over time, that self-pity was expensive and paid no interest. He felt the clean, particular weight of something that was over. He pulled out onto Wellington and turned east. He was 2 blocks away when his phone rang through the car's system. Unknown number. He had a policy about unknown numbers, which was to let them go to voicemail. He let it go to voicemail. It rang again 30 seconds later. Same number. He answered, "Mr. Carter." A woman's voice. Not Kovac. Someone else. "I'm calling from Hargrove Capital. Mr. Baird would like to speak with you." Colin pulled into a loading zone on Front Street and put the car in park. "Put him through," he said. There was a click. Then Baird's voice, without preamble. "Where are you?" 2 blocks south of you." "Come back up. Can I ask why?" A pause. "Not a long one. You can ask when you get here." He left the car in the loading zone. If he got a ticket, he got a ticket. The receptionist was off the phone when he came back through the door. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she had been told to expect him but not told why, which put her in the same situation as him. "Mr. Baird's office is, I know where it is," he said. He'd clocked it on the way out. Third door on the right corner. Baird was standing when he came in. That was different. There was no one else in the room. Kovac was gone. The two young men were gone. Just Baird and a view of the lake through the window that Colin had not been positioned to see from the boardroom. "Sit down," Baird said. Colin sat. Baird didn't sit. He stood at the window for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking at something Colin couldn't see or wasn't meant to see. 31 years ago, Baird said, "I was interviewed for a position at Richardson and Associates. You know the firm? I know of it. They were the second largest independent advisory in the country at the time. I wanted that job badly. I was 32. I had 2 young children. My wife had just gone back to school, and I needed the position in the way that only feels possible when you're 32. He turned from the window. "They asked me a version of the same question we asked you today, whether I could operate within an institutional framework after several years of working for myself." Colin said nothing. "I told them what they wanted to hear," Baird said. "I said yes, absolutely. I had been independent out of circumstance and not preference, and I was well suited for collaborative oversight environments." He sat down then, across the desk. "I got the job, and I spent 4 years there performing the version of myself I had described in that interview. And then I left and started this firm, which is what I'd wanted to do all along." "Why are you telling me this?" Baird picked up a pen. "Because you didn't do that. You told Theo that you weren't responsible for optics. You told Renata that you didn't know if you could operate within our governance structure. Both of those things are true." "I'm aware." Baird set the pen down. "The 2 other candidates I mentioned, both of them told us exactly what we wanted to hear. Renata liked them. The committee would approve them. They would perform adequately in the role for a reasonable period of time, and the work would be acceptable." Colin looked at him and waited. "We're not looking for adequate," Baird said. "We have adequate. I have spent 31 years building something that does not need more adequate." He paused. "What I don't have is someone who will tell a room full of people with money and authority that he can't guarantee his own performance, and do it without flinching." "That wasn't bravery," Colin said. "It was just accurate. I know." Baird almost smiled. "That's the part I can't train." The room was quiet for a moment. Below the window, the lake was flat and pale in the morning light. A ferry was crossing toward the island, slow and unhurried. "The governance requirements are real," Baird said. "Renata's concerns are legitimate. If you come on, there will be an adjustment period, and it will be uncomfortable, and you will have to report to structures that you've been your own authority over for 9 years. I understand. Do you want the position?" Colin thought about the question for the right length of time, which was not very long. "Yes," he said. "Then we have a conversation to finish." He didn't call anyone when he got back to his car. There was a parking citation under the wiper, orange against the gray of the hood. He folded it and put it in the glove compartment. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. He thought about the version of the morning where he had said what they wanted to hear, where he had assured the room that he was a collaborative team player who embraced institutional governance, using the exact vocabulary they were listening for. He could have said it. He'd heard it said enough times. He knew the shape of it the way you know the shape of a sentence in a language you've never spoken but have read a great deal. That version of the morning would have ended differently, he thought, or maybe it would have ended the same way, and the difference was only that he would have spent the rest of the drive home carrying something heavier. He wasn't certain. He'd never been good at modeling counterfactuals when they involved his own behavior. He pulled out of the loading zone and merged into the traffic on Front Street and turned on the radio, which was playing something he didn't recognize but was not unpleasant. At a red light on Jarvis, he thought about Ava and the River Project. He was going to call her tonight and tell her that the thing she was looking for was not the river itself, but the way everything around it depended on everything else around it. That was the ecosystem. Not a single element, but the relationships between all of them. She would probably still find that annoying. He thought it was the truest answer he had, and he intended to give it anyway. The light changed. He drove east through the mid-morning city toward whatever came next.